¿Funciona? Ah, sí. Vale. Hello, everyone, and thanks a lot for attending this special conference because it's going to be a different topic to what we are used to. I think it's a wonderful topic, really, really fascinating, and it's going to be given by Nerea Maestu that I'm going to introduce. Nerea is a PhD student at the Department of History of Art and at the University Complutense de Madrid, where she is working on a thesis entitled Observations and Representation of the Cosmos, Comets in the Hispanic Medieval Tradition. Thanks to a FPU grant, una beca FPU, that she was awarded, and under the supervision of professors Laura Fernandez, who is an art historian at the Complutense, and myself. She obtained a bachelor's degree in History of Art from University Complutense de Madrid in 2018, and a master's degree in Preservation of Historical and Artistic Heritage from the University of Granada in 2019. She has also been awarded a High Intro Fellowship at the Instituto de Lenguas y Cultura del Mediterráneo y Oriente Próximo of CSIC, and has undertaken research stays at the Spanish School of History and Archaeology, also CSIC, in Rome, and at the Instituto de Estudios Medievais of the Universidad Nova de Lisboa. So she has been in several stays in international organized institutes for her research projects. She is a member of the research group Art and Scientific Culture, Images, Objects, and Spaces of Knowledge, as well as the project The Historiographical Legacy of Alfonso X, Sources, Influences, and Readings. So, hello, Nerea, thanks for coming. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Monse, for this very kind presentation. Also for giving me the opportunity to talk about this topic here, which is, I think, quite a strange audience for me, but I think you might find it interesting. I've given the title to my presentation of Fire Stars That Appear in the Air, which is like a direct translation of what you might find in Latin treatises when they define comets. That's what I'm going to be talking about. Visual codifications of comets in the medieval times, and in particular during the late Middle Ages. It is a very interesting topic, I think. I mean, it's my thesis, but it is interesting because it intertwines history of science and history of art from many different points of view. It is not a new topic for history of science. I mean, we have excellent catalogs of comets registers, I mean, since ancient times, but it does not happen the same when you talk about how this knowledge was visually encoded, how was it visually represented. We do have some studies about comet representations from the scientific revolution of the 17th century until the 19th century. But if we go further in time, we don't have, I mean, we have some things, but not much. So that's what I'm doing in my thesis. I'm creating a little database with a very simple software, which is an OpenStreetMap, in which I'm able to localize every single register that I have of comet sightings in the medieval times in Europe. That's the region that I'm working with, and especially with comet representations. It allows me to localize them in space, but also in time, because it has different layers, so I can visualize how often they were produced during the centuries. Since I am an art historian, I am particularly interested in how scientific knowledge was visually encoded and how it contributed, or not, maybe it did nothing, to cometary theory in the late Middle Ages. So before diving into these cometary representations, we need to understand how comets were understood during medieval times. Some of you, I assume there are many astrophysics here, so I'm not going to discover the wheel for you, but let's do a little bit of theory before. As you might know, we have to imagine our universe as being geocentric with the Earth in the center and configured by a series of concentric spheres. As you know, in the Aristotelian model, there was a sublunar sphere under the moon that was formed by several layers, the layer of the earth, water, air, and fire. And above it, you would have different spheres in which the planets will move in perfect circular circles. And closing, the universe will be an eighth sphere that will be like the sphere of the fixed stars. This is the region of perfection, of immobility, of divinity, and this is the region of change, of corruption and generation. Where do we put a comet? A comet is a body that suddenly appears in the sky, stays there for 1 week, 2 weeks, a month, and then disappears. It is not possible that it belongs to the higher spheres. It has to be something like logically that happens in the atmosphere. So comets are not celestial bodies, they are atmospheric phenomena. This is completely wrong from our perspective, but we have to bear in mind that this makes sense inside a model that with all your eyes works for them. So what were comets to them? According to Aristotle's Meteorology, which is the main book that we're going to be talking about today, comets were like big masses of hot and dry exhalations. Exhalations is a kind of matter that would come out of the air and they will rise up until the higher parts, upper parts of the air, where they will touch the layer of fire and they will burn. That meaning that exhalation was like the fuel that would create the characteristic long tails of the comet. So when you would run out of fuel, you wouldn't have a comet anymore. We have it here in this little diagram. Also, Aristotle says that when these great masses of exhalation formed, they would corrupt the air around it. So they would provoke strong winds, lack of rain, drought, and illnesses. So from very early on, they were linked to catastrophic things and eventually to death of people, death of princes, political turmoils. So obviously, we're going to be working with some very allegorical and kind of astrological way of thinking. So, for example, a practical example is this manuscript from the 15th century in which we see the spheres of the sublunar region. We have the moon, the layer of fire, the layer of air, and on the upper part of the layer of air, we have a small, tiny dot, which, as the text says, is the stella comata qua in aere cum celo movet, meaning this is the comet that moves in the air. And below it are other phenomena, like, for example, hic donitura et alie impressiones generantur, meaning this is the region where thunders and thunderbolts and lightnings are created. We have to understand that according to a prioristic model of the universe, every single atmospherical phenomenon was because of the same thing. They were all manifestations of the very same cause. So thunders, lightnings, rainbows, hail, even the Milky Way were all similar in essence to a comet. So we're going to find many representations of comets related to these other phenomena. There's a big confusion that we will later see how it's resolved. Since I'm going to be talking about medieval cometary theory, I'm going to divide it in two big phases. The first of it is early Middle Ages, since the beginning of the Middle Ages, after the fall of Rome, until the first half of the 12th century, when something very important, we'll see, happens. And after that, we will be working with my main group of manuscripts, which were produced in the late Middle Ages, from the second half of the 12th century until the 15th century. I'm going to give particular attention to one treaty on comets, which is the Liber de Significatione Cometarum, or Book on the Meaning of Comets. How the visually encode that was created in this scientific treatise was later transferred to other kinds of materials. And in the end, I will be talking a little bit about first systematic cometary observations and how these both ways of understanding, an allegorical, astrological way and a more systematic scientific way, were alive at the same time, and they were working hand by hand. So in the early Middle Ages, what we have is this. This is a Carolingian manuscript. It's a manuscript created in France in the 9th century, in which we have a calendar with a month and every single thing that happened during that month. And in the end, we have special things that happened during that year. And in this case, for example, we have a comet that appeared in the calendars of May, meaning the beginning of the month of May of the year 848, sorry, or another register in which we have like a similar new with a little bit more information. It tells that it was visible for 23 days and that it appeared in the constellation of Leo, and then it moved to Gemini, but nothing else. We only have registers. We do know that we have other registers of comets that were linked to major political events. Like, for example, this is very famous. Some of you, Monse, know that you know this, but I'm sure that some of you might know it. Is the earliest representation of the comet Halley, the Halley comet that we know of, which is depicted in the Bayeux tapestry. This is a very long tapestry that was created for the Cathedral of Bayeux, in which is depicted the events that led to the conquest of England by the Normans. So we have all the battles, but there's a very important scene in which suddenly we see that there are some people pointing up to the sky to a certain star, which happens to be a comet. And because we know in which year the Battle of Hastings, which is this is representing, happened, is the year 1066, we know this is the comet Halley. But it also plays a very strong part in the succession of events that led to the conquest of Normandy. Because, let's see, this is like a comic book. First of all, the King Edward of England is dead, and another person, its cousin named Harold, rises to the throne. And people are really astonished that he's doing that because he's not a legitimate king, so he shouldn't be in the throne of England. And the people that are astonished about him doing that are slowly turning their backs to the next scene, where they are pointing up to the sky, where they are seeing Comet Halley. And the next thing is that someone is telling the king that someone saw something in the sky. Later on, one of these people crosses the sea, goes from England to France, and tells the Duke of Normandy, William, that what the king did. So immediately what he decided is like chop off all the trees in a forest and start building ships in order to create the flow to conquer England. So here, what we have is like the comet is not only a record, it's not only something that happened in the sky and nothing else. It has a strong political component to it, and it's like the cause that has led to many different future political events. We will see that this association between comets, illness, and deaths of kings and political distress is something that is going to be very present in all the manuscripts that I'm going to be talking about later. So, apart from registers, what we have are treatises that try to analyze from a, let's say, scientific or rationally, let's say rational better way, how comets were created and what was the nature of them. We know that, unfortunately, Aristotle's meteorology was not known in Europe until the first half of the 12th century, because this work was never translated into Latin and it became lost. They didn't know it. But somehow, some ideas of his theory of escalations were alive in other works. like, for example, Eratosthenius' pronostications of, or, for example, mainly Pliny the Elder's natural history, in which he names many different kinds of comets. I will be talking about them later, depending on how they look and how they are shaped. So these classical Greek works were like reinterpreted by early Christian writers, like, for example, you may know Isidore of Seville or Gregory of Tours, and they were reinterpreted in a Christian key, giving them as a Christian meaning. Later on, when monks in their monasteries were trying to analyze this knowledge, trying to copy this knowledge, and they would arrive to the part in which comets were explained, they didn't know really what they were looking at. And if you read the text of Isidore Seville, he says that the star is a hairy star. Hairy because cometes, as you might know, comes from the Greek word cometa, which means hair. So a cometa is a star with hair. So the monk in a manuscript in a monastery that is reading this description, when he has to depict a comet, what is he going to do? He's literally depicting a comet as a lock of hair. Can you say it there? It's a star with some little rays on the top, but the rest of the body is literally hair. Also, we can find something similar here. This is again an excerpt out of Isidore's Etymologies, in which we find the description of a comet here, which, as you can see, has nothing to do with what we would see in the sky when a comet appears. It is just a big star with very big rays. That it's again similar to what the text is saying. It has nothing to do with direct observation of the sky. It is curious too that is followed by several other atmospherical phenomena, as I told you before. For example, the winds. This is a beautiful wheel of winds, or the rainbow, which was in essence, as I told you before, the same as a comet. Another example that I find particularly beautiful is in this manuscript that was created in the monastery of Santa Maria de Ripoll in Catalonia in the year 1056 by a very famous person of the time, which is the monk Oliva. What he did was writing a book that would compile all the knowledge that he had on astronomical things, all in one book, like a Computus book. So in the part where he's describing different constellations, you see this is the constellation of Canis Major with the star Sirius, and also the constellation of the Hare. In the middle of that, suddenly he introduces an interpolation of Isidore's Etymologies in which he explains what a comet is. This does not really make sense, but I think it's like he's describing the star Sirius as being the most bright one, the brightest one in the night sky. So he remembers a comet. So he introduced a little bit of information about a comet. When we see the representation, we see a human face inside a circle with rays. Well, every art is free, but in this case, this representation is not free at all. What he's doing, he's remembering, because he has read before Pliny the Elder's natural history. And one of the comets that Pliny the Elder has previously described has the face of a woman in a white star crossing the sky. So he is literally representing ancient knowledge from the Greece in an early medieval manuscript. This is what was happening. Sorry, I'm going to bring a little bit of... I'm sorry about the chronology. I'm going to be talking about 1,000 years of history, but in the end, it's not that complicated. Okay, so that's what was happening in the East. What was happening that what was happening in the West? What was happening in the East, in the other side of the Mediterranean? Well, this Aristotelian knowledge that was lost to the West was actually preserved in Islamic context, because when they were spreading throughout former Roman and Byzantine territories, they would get in contact with these books and with this knowledge. So Islamic thinkers copy these books, they translate them from Greek to Arabic thanks especially to the sponsorship of the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad. And that's how we know that Aristotle's metrology was known in Arabic context, in Arabic in the 10th century. But they don't only copy, they don't only translate, they produce new knowledge starting from these Greek pieces. They mix Greek, Indian, Arab, Bedouin knowledge and their own observations, and they create new treatises, as some of you may know. And we know that some of the most important Arabic astronomers wrote at least some things on comets. One of them is special, is Ibn Ta's treatise, in which he reproduces again different kinds of comets. So we have arrived now to the center of our business here today, which is cometary representations in the late medieval ages. So these treatises that had been translated into Greek in the Arabic context, and these new Arabic works that were created there were translated into Latin again in some parts of Europe that were in contact with Islam, namely Al-Andalus, obviously, and Sicily. So there are certain cities like the city of Toledo or the city of Barcelona that are very active places of translation and copy of manuscripts. Again, so finally, after more than 1,000 years, Aristotle's metrology its return to the West, and it is translated into Latin in the year 1140 in Toledo by a very important person who is Gerardus de Cremona. Another very important works to expand the knowledge that people in the West had about comets are the translation of Ptolemy's Quadrite Partitum or Tetrabiblus, meaning 4 books, which is important to us because it is crucial, because what Aristotle said only about comets is that they were forming the atmosphere and that they could corrupt the air and cause winds and droughts. But what Ptolemy said is that comets were also associated to planets, so they would, the influence of the planets would have some impact on comets on Earth. So he allows comets to have an astrological reading, which was not done before. There are other 2 books that are important to me because they deal in more depth with comets, which are the Centiloquium and the Cometis, which both were ascribed to Ptolemy, but they are not. They are probably 10th century Arabic creations that were translated again into Arabic. But what interests me here is that we finally, in this treatise called the Cometis, we find 9 kinds of comets, one of each having their own name. And this is what we're going to find in many late medieval comets. The comet Beru, Tenaculum, Pertica, Miles, Dominicus Ascone, Matuta, etc. This here is a manuscript of a copy of Aristotle's metrology that was created for Oxford students of the 13th century. They were studying natural philosophy. And here we have a depiction of Aristotle pointing at the sky. When you see there's fire coming out of it, there are like different bolids, or we don't know what's this, like atmospherical phenomena, and also a monster coming out of the sky. This new received knowledge led to an explosion of creation of astronomical treatises in Europe during the 13th to 15th centuries. This is like an abbreviated list of people that wrote on comets, or at least mentioned them. What is interesting is now we perceive there's a new way of looking at things. Aristotelian thought, which is more materialistic, gives more importance, gives more attention at how things are actually created. And many of the treatises that we have here were written after the direct sighting of a certain comet. Many of them, in the prologues, they say that they are writing this work because people are really scared and they are really astonished because they don't understand what they are seeing in the sky when a comet appears. It is very particular, the case of the comets of in the year 1264, which was seen all over Europe. Apparently was one of the most brightest comets ever witnessed. And even 1 century later, in this manuscript that is called the Nuova Cronica by Giovanni Villani, we find the description of the comet, and we find a group of scholars, a group of astronomers pointing at the sky. At you don't really see it here, but there's a small red stars that the star they are pointing at. Many of these treatises are like this. They are not beautiful at all for art historian like me. They are workbooks. They are something that they are made for working with. They don't have images, or they don't have sumptuary value. But that's not the case with a very special one, which is the Liber de Significatione Cometarum that I told you in the beginning, which since the beginning does have an iconic component to it. So what's this? What's this Liber de Significatione Cometarum, or book on the meaning of comets? It is an anonymous treatise that we know that was written in the Iberian Peninsula around the year 1238, but we don't really know where. In the beginning, we thought it was like a genuine Latin creation. We thought it was like the earliest treatise on comets that we knew of. But now, after a linguistic analysis of it, we think that it is more likely to be a Latin translation of an earlier Arabic work. It cites many authorities, many Greek authorities, and also many Arabic ones like Aristotle, Ptolemy, Abu Masar, Al-Kindi, also the Babylonians. And it is important for us because it settles what's going to be the structure of the next treatises on comets for the next 2 centuries. All the next treatises are going to be structured like that. First, there's going to be like one more astronomical part, we can say, and then a purely astrological part. In this first astronomical part, what we find is an explanation of the nature of comets, an explanation of its causes, its effects, and then we have the astrological part, in which we see the author explains the meaning of every single comet depending on their shape, their specific location on the celestial vault, and duration. And also, it's very interesting because they all introduce a part in which they recount former historical comets of the past, which is a way of acknowledging that what they are saying is right, because I am exposing all this theory, but all of this is true because in the past, this has happened before. And this is it is in this part that we know that this treaty was written here in the Iberian Peninsula, because it describes one comet that appeared in that year during the rebellion of a very important Andalusian character, which is Ibn Hud in Almeria, who was killed that year, who was executed that year. So it gives us like chronological landing to understand it. It also gives, in comparison, if we compare it to early medieval treatises, it gives more attention to what we call a new way of looking, an interest in recording the trajectories and positions of comets more accurately. In this case, it incorporates one quote from Ali Ben Rayel, in which he says that, he describes one comet, giving the exact location of every single planet in that day in which the comet appeared. And he says, and et totum istut quod dico, vidi oculis meis, et alti multi sapientes qui, meaning everything that I'm saying, I've seen it with my own eyes, and many people from before me, many saints from the past have also seen this. So I'm not making this up. As I said, the Liber de Significatione Cometarum has depictions of comets since its very earlier stages of life. This is quite new. I actually received this manuscript like 1 week ago, so this is quite exciting. And what we see is that in this chapter, when he's describing the 9 types of comets that Ptolemy had described before, And the text says, this is the comet, for example, Ascone in Arabic is called Aduadifa, and this is its figure. So in the text, we know that it's indicating that it is accompanied by a depiction. But well, when we take a look at it, what do we see? I have no idea, actually. It looks like a kind of symbol that the copies is making up. We don't really know, but it does not really make sense that that's a treaty that is giving more attention to direct observation. It's suddenly representing comets like this. What I think is that since our treaty, the Liber de Significatione Cometarum, in origin is Arabic, had some depictions of Arabic comets. And the Arabic comet, when we work with certain Arabic manuscripts, this is not very often, but they are very special. They are very special. But in some of them, we can find certain depictions of comets like this. So what my hypothesis is, the copyist of the Liber de Significatione Cometarum saw this and wrote this in a sense. In this particular case has more links to our treaty, because even though this is a 11th century manuscript that was written in Egypt, and it is also thought to be given to the Fatimida governors, the text that it's written here is the same as we can find in our treaty. So it has different differences because of the translation, but we know and we have to expect that the original manuscript of our Liber de Significatione Cometarum had to be something like this. Something happened in the 15th century. This progress in the way of looking at things gave more attention, more relevance to comets. And a manuscript, a treaty like the Liber de Significatione Cometarum, that was not really that well known, it was not really that special, and we only know 2 copies of it before the 14th century. Suddenly, in the 15th century, 1 century later, we have many copies of it, many. And they are not only the text, they incorporate like a fully complete iconographical display of comets. So for example, this is the same text in a German translation of the text, in which, for example, in the astrological part of the treaty, when he's talking about the different effects of a comet when they appear in a certain sign, in this case, for example, the sign of Aquarius, we see that the text here has a secondary role. It is more important, they made in this treaty. Estoy apuntando, pero no se ve nada, ¿no? We don't really see anything. Bueno, let's imagine. So what we see here is a depiction of the comet. For example, do you see that sword over there that has 2 blades? That's the comet. That's the comet. And next to the sign of the zodiac, which is inside a wheel. And next to it, there's a scholar expressing in that bocadillo what the comet is going to foretell. What is interesting is that the comet that accompanies the image has nothing to do with the image. So in the text, for example, we find this assertion. He says, when a comet appeared in the sign of Aquarius, it saw that a king would die in the eastern part, and someone would rise up who would claim the kingdom, and there will be great mortality among men and wars in the western parts, and this will last for a very long time. And the air will be thick, dark, with many bolts and lightnings. Again, the association between bolts, lightnings, and... ¿Sí? ¿Funciona? Okay. Vale. No. And the pregnant woman will die, I think it says anymore. So here, there's no description of a comet here. There's only the meaning of it. But the copyist of this treaty has decided to apply the description of comets that has been expressed in other parts of the treaty to these parts of the manuscript. The same happens, the same happens in this other chapter, in which it explains the The meaning of a comet depending if it's related to a triplicity that I'm not going to be explaining it now. And also gives the representation of a comet, for example, here Cornu, which is one of the types of comets given by Ptolemy, next to the 3 signs of the zodiac. This had really well response, and it was copied all throughout southern Germany. And its influence had direct impact in other works, like, for example, this astronomical/astrological work that was written in Ulm, Germany in 1464, in which, again, we find a description of comets next to a very horrendous depiction of it. Here, the comet you see is not a horn or a sword. What it is a human skull dripping blood over it. So there's a further codification in what comet foretell. Not all these manuscripts are like this. These different manuscripts that describe the 9 types of comets, some of them have a very beautiful component to them. For example, this French treatise, which is again a French translation of the Liber de Significatione Cometarum, has beautiful depictions of them with gold and blue. And it's also interesting that it has taken out all the astronomical or scientific components, all the numerical information, and it's only quite didactic. Again, another example, now from the Iberian Peninsula, is this written by Ludovico d'Angulo, in which, again, we find the same thing. Descriptions of comets, and then very simple schematic representations. But in this case, all these horrendous, fearless, fear that is supposed to provoke fear in the spectator is not present. Again, another translations to French. I like, for example, this one, which is a comet that is supposed to be a palm tree with a star in the center. Or again, we see this comet that has a human face inside it. It's like there's both a transmission of a textual tradition, but also way bigger interest on representing how reality actually is. I'm going to change the topic a little bit to be talking about how these treatises that have 9 types of comets had their impact on other creations, like, for example, historical chronicles. It is quite normal, not quite normal, but it is not strange that we find, for example, the representation of comets in historical chronicles, both legendary and historical, but also sometimes the text information that these scientific treatises express are depicted in these manuscripts, in these historical chronicles. For example, this Stdent that represents the death of the king Ludovico Pius, after he has seen, one of his astronomers has seen a star, a comet in the sky. We see here that Ludovico is ill in bed, he's about to die, and he's dividing his kingdom between his 2 sons. And in the background, what we see is a comet up there and 2 physicians or doctors looking at a flask with urine, which was a typical way of diagnostication in the late medieval times. Again, for example, this is another historical chronicle in which we read about very important political events of that moment. For example, the craziness of the King of England that is plucking his son's eyes out, the martyrdom of another king whose head is being protected by a wolf, or the apparition of the ghost of Louis the Germanic to his son, Charles the Fat. And suddenly, between all these events that are really political, we find the representation of the comets that appear in the sky in the year 677 that caused great floods all in Saxony. The relationship between floods and comets is something that is really often expressed in different treatises. Like, for example, one that was created at the same time that this copy was created, which is the Treaty of Giovanni d'Alegnano, or in the prognosis made by John of Stdent at the same time. Another example of this transfer of iconographical transfer between astrological treatise and historical chronicle is the song de Pestilence, which is a poem in this case, in which the author is describing the events that are going to lead to the big plague of Black Death in that assaulted Europe in the year 1348. It is a poem. It has nothing to do with correction in numbers, but when he decides to illustrate this story, he says that the events that led to the plague were a triple conjunction of Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter, an eclipse, and a comet. And he's choosing to depict this with a kind of scientific diagram that we would find in scientific treatises, but this is completely wrong because, as you see, the comet here is above Mars, and the eclipse, the moon is also in the sphere of Jupiter. So he's just using scientific visual codification to express the ideas of a poem. Later on, if we remember that comet with the shape of a sword, we can see it in other stories. For example, these two manuscripts over here tell the story of the presages that precede to the destruction of Jerusalem, that are told in a historical work by Flavius Josephus, in which they say that when Jerusalem was going to be destructed, they saw a comet in the sky, and what they choose to represent this comet is exactly one of the comets that is being depicted in the Liber de Significatione Cometarum. Something similar happens in this case with the comet Rosa, which is apparently the only comet that is going to bring good things to the world. So in this story about the founder of Belgium, Babo, he's supposed to see one comet in the sky, and what we see up there are two comets. There's like a normal kind of nativity star, and next to it there's a rose with a face inside, and that rose with a face inside it's exactly what we would find if we would go back to this Liber de Significatione Cometarum or other manuscripts. And also it relates to Pliny the Elder. So an idea that I want to express is that, and I think I've already done it, is that at the same time that these allegorical treatises were really successful, the first systematical observation of comets were taking place. And for example, as soon as the year 1299, a French scholar called Pierre de Limoges was looking at a comet that appeared in the sky, and he's doing a quite thoroughly description of the phenomenon. He's saying in which degrees and even the minutes of the constellation the comet is moving through. And he's also saying something really interesting, that he's looking at a comet with an instrument called turquetum, apparitionis initio per turquetum. So he's actually using like some engine to look at the sky. That instrument, the turquetum, is this is the earliest depiction we have of it. It's I don't really understand it, to be honest, but it allows you to have different pairs of celestial coordinates. But even if he's trying to analyze the trajectory and even the distance of the comet from the Earth, he's also naming this comet Dominus Ascone, which is one of the names that was given to comets in astrological treatises. This interest of depiction of comets in a way more naturalistic way we can find in a very famous place that some of you may have even been there, which is the Capilla Scrovegni in Padova, in which Giotto, when he was depicting the birth of Jesus and the rise of the three magic kings, the three wise men, the star of Bethlehem, he depicted it as a star with a tail. And that star with a tail coincides in time with the Halley's comet passing in the year 1301. Visually, it is quite, it has some resemblance to what the comet Halley has in this photograph of the year 1910. How much? ¿Cuánto tiempo tengo? Ya, ¿no? O 10 minutitos. Bueno, pues nada. Vale, vale. Okay. So both mental operations are happening at the same time. We have to go further in time until we reach the second half of the 15th century, in which we actually see that comets are being represented in the actual celestial vault. For example, here, this is a very famous treatise by Paolo del Pozzo Toscanelli, in which the comet is no longer a horrendous monster with a human skull or has flames or whatever. It is only a dot that is being traced throughout different constellations. Here, for example, we have the constellation of Serpentario. And in particular, this comet that was being seen by Paolo del Pozzo Toscanelli in 1457, in January of 1457, I have not done this, other people have done it. We can trace its future apparitions, and actually the comet that we had been able to see in the past weeks is actually the same comet that Paolo del Pozzo Toscanelli was represented back in the 15th century. Again, both ideas. Petrus Appianu discovers that the tail of the comet always points against the sun, but at the same time, people are representing comets still inside the celestial, the atmospherical sphere. So I'm finishing my presentation with this, which is how a codification of comets was created in order to explain them, and how it survived new knowledge that was received later on. Okay, sorry, that's all.
Thank you so much, Nerea. We're going to give some time for questions now, so raise your hand if you have one, or ask through Zoom.
So, how many comets have you been able to identify so far?
How many?
Yeah, I mean, comets that we have seen.
I don't know the number, but at least 3 each century. There are centuries that are lots of comet sightings, comet registrations, and there are at least 1 every century, which is Halley's comet. That's always recorded, always depicted since very early on. But there are other centuries in which we don't really know why. We don't really find many records. For example, the 14th century, which is a century very prone to allegorical interpretation of omens, we don't really find many of them. So it has to do also with the properties of the atmospherical conditions of a certain moments of time. But yeah, I might have like more than 100. I don't know, but I will have to check.
Thanks for the talk. Very, very interesting. And I have many questions, but the first one would be, what's your plans for your database? Are you going to give that to astronomers? And because that would be an interesting database for comets and predict maybe comets that are not known now, and vice versa. Perhaps you could use the comets that are registered today to try to trace back in time some sightings. And this relates to my second question. It's like, how do you find the registers for comets? To me, it sounds like looking for a needle in a haystack, looking for all the literature and everything. It sounds like a very big amount of work.
Luckily, I'm working with, as a medieval says on on the shoulders of giants, because there are many very good catalogs of records of comets in former bibliography. what I'm going to do, I mean, but it is true that many depictions of them are not present in these catalogs. I don't really know what I'm going to do in it now. It's a work in progress. It's still growing every single day when I find something. In the end, it may become public. I don't know. We'll see. But it has to offer something really new to be able to make it public. And how do I find representations of comets? Reading the sources. There are some database, both iconographical and historical database in which you can search, but also you have to go back to the library and start reading chronicles. And when you find a description that somehow matches with the apparition of a comet, a bolide, a shooting star, then you go back to the primary sources like manuscripts, and you might find an image there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you, Nerea, for your talk. I think it was very interesting. My question
Thank you.
is, in the centuries and the geographical space you have studied, did you find any evidence that they were able to make predictions on the appearance of comets, or they were completely random events? Because I guess that some events were like predictable, like the sun rising every day, and others were like random. So in the case of comets, what category would be?
The problem with comets is that it never looks like what it used to in the past. Whereas you can predict eclipse, some people in the medieval ages were perfectly able to predict both lunar and solar eclipses. You can do the same with comets. You don't know where it's going to appear, in which part of the sky, in which month. So no, they thought, and that's what made them fearful. The thing that you can't control them, and you don't know what effects are going to have it in your wall. So no, that's something very interesting, because the Pythagorean, Pythagoricos, to understand ourselves, back in the 5th century before Christ, 8th century before Christ, they thought that comets were planets, that they were planets that have a very big orbital, so they will return. They were the first ones to express that comets could be something recurrent. But that idea, even though it was known all throughout the medieval ages, because it was copied, it was not approved. It happened the same with Seneca. Seneca also said that comets were celestial bodies. But since that idea didn't fit in a model of the universe that is completely closed and perfectly built, that idea was not forgotten, but like put aside. So yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, Nerea. Thank you for the talk.
Thank
I
you.
have two questions. One is you speaking about the Western culture, Islamic, the influence of India, that have also influence from Mongolian and China culture.
Well, that's not. I don't really know much about Mongolia. I know that there are fantastic comet records from China and also from India. I don't know about Mongolia. In particularly, also Korea and Japan have amazing records of comets. Like until the 16th century with Tycho Brahe, comet sightings are always better in the East, in China and Japan and Korea, without a doubt. I don't know much about their representation, how they were depicted. There's a tomb in China, the Magandui tomb, in which we find a beautiful repertory like of 30 kinds of comets depicted in a way that is quite similar to the manuscript of Cambridge, of that very symbolic manuscript that I showed you before, the 14th century one. But how did it influence? And for me, it would be like very handy to say that Chinese knowledge about comets had some influence in Europe, but I have not been able to trace that. The only connection point is Islam and Byzantium. Yeah.
The other one question is about the representation. you present us the representation of a woman face,
Mhm.
but for example, in the Islamic culture, is not something that will be happen. I don't know. You have any example of that in the Islamic culture, or is something done and never happened in the past?
Well, first of all, we tend to think that Islamic culture is it is not allowed to represent human bodies or animals in Islamic culture. This is not true. I mean, this is something that is very spread. It is forbidden to represent humans and Mahoma in religious context. When you are not talking about religion, you are able to represent many, many things. That's why, for example, in Granada, when you go to the Alhambra, we find a full representation of 10 kings of Granada, or we have beautiful representations of animals, people, naked woman in castles in Syria, for example. So when we are talking about non-religious context, we do find images of people in Islam. But also, I don't have the picture here. When they do represent people, they don't do it naturalistically. They do it symbolically, in a very schematic way. Here, this one, these are faces. These are faces. Those are faces on comets. This is a symbolic way of representing nature. They do deny that they are quite Platonic in that sense, that they refuse to represent nature in their real way, but they do it. That's how they do it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other question? No. Okay. Then let me check if there's anything on Zoom and we'll end this. Okay, so there's nothing. Thank you so much, Nerea. It was a great presentation and we thank you so much. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much for listening to me.